When these German women were captured, the war didn't simply strip them of freedom. It stripped them of every layer of protection they thought existed. The moment the uniforms came into view, confusion turned into hostility. To their captors, these women represented a contradiction that provoked anger rather than sympathy. They were enemies, yes. But worse, they were women who had dared to step outside the roles the world expected of them. In that instant, they became something easier to punish, easier to dehumanize. Most of these women had never imagined themselves as future prisoners. They had not carried rifles or charged across battlefields. Many believed their work as nurses, clerks, radio operators, or assistants placed them on the margins of combat. They told themselves they were helping, not harming. They wore uniforms, saluted officers, and believed they were serving their country honorably. The idea that this service could mark them for extraordinary suffering never truly entered their minds. War, they assumed, had rules. Prisoners were protected. Women, especially, were supposed to be treated differently. That assumption collapsed the moment they were taken. When enemy soldiers discovered German women in uniform, reactions were often immediate and brutal. To Soviet troops, these women symbolized the invasion that had burned villages and killed families. The sight of a female enemy didn't soften that rage. It sharpened it. They were not seen as caregivers or helpers. They were labeled fascists. Collaborators, embodiments of the regime that had brought devastation to Soviet soil. Their gender did not shield them. Instead, it became part of the accusation. They were guilty twice over. Even before reaching prison camps, the punishment began. Coats, boots, and personal belongings were stripped away under the open sky. Transport itself became a trial of endurance. Days on trucks. Exposed to freezing winds, hunger gnawing before captivity had even officially begun. By the time the gates of the camps closed behind them, many already understood a terrible truth. Survival would not depend on rules, only on endurance. What made their situation uniquely precarious was how completely they fell outside every established category. They were not civilians, yet not recognized as soldiers. They were prisoners, yet rarely treated as protected captives. The laws of war had been written largely with men in mind. And in practice, those protections were uneven even for male prisoners. For women, the gaps were vast. There was no clear script for how they were to be handled. And in that ambiguity, abuse found room to grow. In both East and West. These women learned quickly that captivity was shaped less by official policy than by power. Who commanded the camp, who stood guard at night, who decided punishments or privileges. These details mattered more than any regulation on paper. A woman could receive food one day and be threatened the next. She could be ignored, singled out, or quietly targeted, all without explanation. Complaints went nowhere. Silence became a survival strategy. What cut deepest was the realization that there was nowhere truly safe. Soviet camps relied on open brutality, exhausting labor, and starvation to break bodies. Western camps, while outwardly cleaner and better supplied, carried their own forms of pressure and fear, often hidden behind discipline and procedure. The women began to understand that the side flying the flag mattered less than the imbalance of power itself. This was the foundation of their ordeal. The moment when captivity revealed that being both enemy and female placed them at the very bottom of the wartime hierarchy. Whatever ideals they had believed in, honor, duty, protection, even mercy, fell away. What remained was a raw struggle to stay alive in a system that saw them not as individuals, but as symbols to be punished. From that moment forward, everything they endured would be shaped by this harsh reality. And nothing about the war would ever look simple again. Captured by the enemy. These women quickly learned that captivity was not a single experience but a spectrum of fear, shaped by who held the keys to the camp gates. As the German front lines collapsed and retreats turned into routes, female nurses, radio operators, clerks, and auxiliaries were often left behind. Many still believed that the rules of war would protect them. That being unarmed women would count for something. That belief vanished the moment they were surrounded, disarmed, and loaded onto trucks, trains, or forced marches into the unknown. For those taken by Soviet forces, the shock was immediate and brutal. Red Army soldiers had marched through burned villages and mass graves left by the German advance. They had seen families starved, homes destroyed, and entire communities erased. When they encountered German women in uniform, it felt like an insult layered on top of rage. These were not helpless civilians in their eyes, but female fascists, visible symbols of the enemy that had torn their world apart. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant dissolved instantly. The first hours of Soviet captivity often set the tone for everything that followed. Personal belongings were stripped away, sometimes violently. Coats, boots, watches, even wedding rings disappeared. Women who had spent years caring for wounded soldiers or tapping out radio messages suddenly found themselves treated as spoils of war. Transport alone became lethal. Packed into open trucks or cattle cars, they traveled for days with little food or water, exposed to freezing winds or suffocating heat. Some never made it to the camps at all, dying quietly along the road and being left behind without names or markers. Arrival did not mean safety. It meant survival under rules designed for punishment rather than custody. Camps deep in the Soviet interior were surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and armed patrols, but the real danger lay in what daily life demanded of the prisoners. Hunger became constant, a dull ache that never left, with rations hovering around starvation levels. Bodies shrank, strength faded, and illness spread easily. Work assignments were merciless. Women labored in forests, mines, and factories, often for 14 hours a day, regardless of weather or physical condition. The message was clear. Labor was the price of staying alive. Yet even within this brutality, confusion began to creep in. The enemy they had been taught to see as backward and barely human looked very different up close. They saw massive industrial plants producing tanks and machinery at a scale Germany could no longer match. They encountered Soviet women in positions of authority. Doctors, engineers, camp administrators, issuing orders with confidence and competence. For women raised under Nazi ideology, which preached rigid gender roles, this was deeply unsettling. The world they thought they understood no longer made sense. Western Allied captivity unfolded along a different path, but it led to its own kind of disillusionment. When American or British forces captured German women, the first impression was often relief. There were beds, regular meals, medical care, and guards who spoke calmly instead of shouting. Compared to Soviet camps, it felt almost humane. Some women even dared to believe that the nightmare was over. That illusion didn't last. Power expresses itself in many ways, and in Western camps it often wore a polite face. Interrogations became psychological battlegrounds. Guards and intelligence officers learned quickly that fear could be wielded without fists. The mere suggestion of being transferred to Soviet custody was enough to break resistance. Isolation, sleep deprivation, and carefully planted lies did the rest. The women understood that their safety was conditional, dependent on compliance and silence. In both systems, Eastern and Western, captivity stripped these women of certainty. They learned that uniforms did not protect them, that ideals collapsed under pressure, and that gender could be as much a liability as nationality. The experience of capture was the moment their old identities truly died, replaced by something far more fragile. The daily calculation of how to survive another night, another interrogation, another march into the cold. For the women who fell into Western Allied hands, captivity unfolded with a strange and unsettling contradiction. On the surface, everything seemed to confirm the image the Allies carefully projected to the world. The camps looked orderly. Barracks had roofs that didn't leak. Food arrived regularly and in quantities that felt almost shocking after months of scarcity. There was bread, meat, sometimes even chocolate. Compared to the frozen labor camps of the East, this felt like mercy. Some women later admitted that their first nights in American or British camps were the first time they slept without fear of freezing to death. But comfort can be deceptive. And it didn't take long for the women to realize that safety here was conditional. The Western camp system was built on control rather than chaos. Everything appeared regulated, documented, and civilized. Guards followed procedures. Officers spoke calmly. Red Cross inspectors arrived on schedule. Cameras captured clean bunks and prisoners standing neatly in line. From the outside, these camps looked like proof of moral superiority. Yet once inspections ended and night settled in, a different reality emerged, one that rarely made it into reports. Power in these camps was exercised quietly. Interrogations were the first place women felt it press down on them. Unlike Soviet questioning, which often relied on shouting and violence, Western interrogators worked on fear and uncertainty. Women were isolated for days or weeks, deprived of sleep, kept under constant light, or subjected to endless questioning that circled the same points again and again. Some were told their families had been killed in bombing raids. Others were warned that refusal to cooperate would result in transfer east, where things were handled differently. No blows were struck. Yet many women broke down faster than they ever would have under physical force. What made this especially devastating was the lack of witnesses. These methods left no bruises, no broken bones. Complaints disappeared into files that were never meant to be opened. The women quickly learned that silence was safer than resistance. In camps where oversight was thin, that silence created space for darker abuses. Guards and officers held absolute authority over rations, work assignments, and privileges. A single accusation of disobedience could mean isolation, hunger, or relocation to harsher facilities. Some women were assigned to special duties, cleaning offices' quarters or working in administrative areas far from the main barracks. Officially, these were routine tasks. Unofficially, they placed women in vulnerable positions, often alone and at night. Refusal was rarely framed as an option. Cooperation brought extra food, warmer clothing, or protection from worse assignments. Resistance carried consequences that everyone understood without needing to say aloud. The camp system quietly created a hierarchy of survival, one that rewarded compliance and punished dignity. Medical care, often cited as proof of humane treatment, carried its own hidden dangers. Women with nursing or medical backgrounds were sometimes used as test subjects for experimental treatments, justified as scientific necessity. Consent was vague or non-existent. Records were written carefully, using neutral language that concealed the reality of what had been done. When deaths occurred, causes were softened, filed away, and forgotten. Perhaps the most disturbing element was the hypocrisy. These women attended mandatory classes about democracy, freedom, and human rights while living under absolute control. They watched films exposing Nazi concentration camps and were confronted with evidence of crimes committed by their own regime. For many, this was genuinely shattering. Yet it also reinforced their powerlessness. After seeing such horrors, who would believe their suffering mattered? Who would listen to women who had served a defeated and criminal state? The Western camps did not rely on constant brutality because they didn't need to. Appearances protected them. History, after all, would be written by the victors. The women understood this instinctively. They saw how easily cruelty could hide behind clean uniforms and polite language. How moral authority could coexist with exploitation. This realization cut deeper than hunger ever could. By the time the war ended, many of these women no longer believed in simple categories of good and evil. The enemy they had feared sometimes showed kindness, while the liberator could abuse power without consequence. That contradiction lingered long after the camps were left behind, forcing these women to confront an uncomfortable truth. Victory does not guarantee virtue, and suffering does not belong to only one side. When the war finally ended, Freedom did not arrive the way these women had imagined during years of captivity. For many, the announcement of Germany's surrender brought not relief, but a new wave of fear and uncertainty. They had survived camps, hunger, forced labor, and humiliation, only to discover that peace did not mean going home. In the East, Soviet authorities saw German women not as former prisoners who had paid their price, but as usable labor. Many were simply told nothing had changed. The fences stayed up. The work details continued. Days blurred into months, and months into years, as women realized that the end of the war applied to others, not to them. Those eventually released faced journeys home that felt unreal. Trains moved slowly through shattered landscapes. Cities that once existed only in memory now appeared as fields of rubble. When women stepped off trains in places like Berlin or Dresden, they struggled to recognize their own hometowns. Streets were gone. Familiar buildings reduced to piles of brick and ash. Families, if they were still alive, lived in cellars, basements, or makeshift shelters. Hunger followed them home. In some cruel twist, women returning from Western camps found that they had eaten better as prisoners than as civilians in defeated Germany. Yet the greatest shock was not physical destruction. It was silence. When these women tried to speak about what had happened to them, conversations ended abruptly. Neighbors looked away. Relatives changed the subject. Germany wanted to rebuild, and rebuilding required forgetting. There was no place in the national story for women who had worn Nazi uniforms and then suffered at the hands of the victors. Their experiences were inconvenient, morally complicated, and deeply uncomfortable. Male prisoners could talk about hardship and be seen as victims of war. Women were treated differently. Questions lingered, unspoken but heavy. How had they survived? What had they done to survive? For those who returned to East Germany, silence was enforced. Some were made to sign documents promising never to speak about Soviet camps. Their suffering conflicted with the official narrative of friendship between socialist states. In the West, stories of abuse in American or British camps clashed with Cold War politics and the need to see former enemies as protectors. So the women learned to stay quiet. Silence became a survival skill that followed them home. The cost of that silence was enormous. Bodies carried lasting damage. Years of malnutrition led to chronic illness. Women who had worked in uranium mines developed cancers decades later. Frostbite left permanent pain. Broken bones that had never healed properly made everyday movement difficult. But the deeper wounds were invisible. Nightmares returned again and again. Sudden noises caused panic. Authority figures inspired fear rather than trust. Many women felt detached from their own lives, as if part of them had been left behind in the camps. They married, raised children, found work, and on the surface lived ordinary lives. Inside, memories stayed locked away. Some told themselves that what they endured was punishment they deserved for having served a criminal regime. Others believed no one would ever listen with sympathy. A few tried to speak out in the 1950s, hoping that time had softened judgment. Publishers rejected their manuscripts. Officials discouraged support groups. The message was clear. This was not the story Germany wanted to tell. Only decades later did cracks begin to appear in that silence. Historians started asking questions. Archives slowly opened. Survivors, now elderly, were finally invited to speak. Many could not. After so many years of repression, the words no longer came. Others spoke briefly, cautiously, as if still afraid of consequences that no longer existed. Their testimonies complicated the simple moral picture of World War II. They did not erase Nazi crimes, but they showed that suffering did not follow neat lines of good and evil. The story of these women forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. War punishes in uneven ways. Gender shapes vulnerability. Power, once unchecked, corrodes ideals on every side. These women were part of a destructive system, but they were also human beings caught in its collapse. Their experiences remind us that history is not just made of victories and defeats, but of lives lived in the shadows afterward, carrying memories that the world was not ready to hear.